Back to European closing bell, live from Davos. I'm standing here with the CEO of Crescent Petroleum, Majid Jafar. Now, Majid, you work in the UAE, you work in Iraq, but you also work in Egypt. And of course, I was speaking earlier today with President Sisi. He says that the optimism is back in Egypt. What's your take?
I think the optimism is coming back in Egypt in a strong way. The stock market obviously reflected that in Egypt, but more than that, the investors are seeing a lot of the issues being resolved. For us in the oil and gas space, our listed affiliate Dana Gas has invested over $2 billion there over the last 7 years. The receivables has improved, and the government has already mentioned or stated it wants to pay them all down by the end of next year. So that's very positive. But apart from that, some of the big infrastructure investments, like the second Suez Canal that was funded from Egyptians, almost like crowdfunding, $8 billion with the credit notes that they issued, is going to add jobs and long-term competitiveness for the economy, as well as revenues, and tackling some of the core issues, above all the youth unemployment, which is the biggest challenge for Egypt and the wider region.
Well, of course, oil prices, the drop in oil prices is a big topic here at the World Economic Forum, and it's something that is on everyone's minds in the Middle East. And you've come up with something called the Arab Sustainability Plan. Tell us about that.
Sure. So the Arab Stabilization Plan takes its cue from the Marshall Plan that the U.S. adapted to post-war Europe. Essentially, how can we channel large amounts of capital into major infrastructure projects like the second Suez Canal and create jobs, in particular for the youth, and long-term competitiveness and sustainability. But Egypt is obviously core in the region, but how can we scale this up and apply it across the wider region? Because, I mean, 4 years after the Arab Spring, youth unemployment, according to the ILO report yesterday, is 30%. It's higher, and it's the fastest rising in the world. So it's now time for an economic revolution.
So many things that you discussed in your plan. We heard from President Sisi as well today when he was speaking to the World Economic Forum. I want to talk specifically about the drop in oil prices and how that's impacting the Gulf states. You work in the Gulf states, you understand what's happening there, but the bigger question is, considering the billions of dollars that Egypt needs in investment and how much money has come from the Gulf in the past, can they continue to count on that kind of support given the drop in oil prices?
Sure. Well, I mean, if prices continue where they are today, that means OPEC overall's revenues will be $500 billion less. Now, there are some expectations that we're probably near the bottom, but how quickly it'll recover, we don't know. The Gulf states have significant funds in the sovereign wealth funds, I mean, up to $4 trillion in total. But there's a lot of capital in the private sector as well, probably at least as much, again, or more, that just needs the confidence to be unlocked. And again, you know, how that fundraising was done is an example of the capital available just within Egypt. So I think it's really about tackling the right reforms, particularly on defining the projects, and the big conference in Sharm el-Sheikh will define $100 billion worth of major infrastructure projects just for Egypt, and we need those kind of things for the wider region. But also looking at some of the education and skills reform, which is critical, and the rigid labor markets, which is a problem in the wider region. These are some of the things we need to tackle in combination. And I think within the region we have the capacity to do it. And we need to break out of this cycle of low growth. I mean, we're growing at 1 to 2% in the MENA region overall. We need to grow at least 5% just to maintain the current levels of employment, which again aren't enough. And only the Gulf is currently anywhere close to that.
When we talk about the Islamic State, how big of an impact is what we're seeing in Syria, in Iraq, having on the wider region?
So I think clearly the region is going through unprecedented changes. I mean, the biggest in a century. And there are states that are failed or failing. And, you know, Iraq and Syria are not even the top of that list. We saw what happened in Yemen this week. You know, Libya clearly is at risk. Sudan has major issues. So many of these countries, it's an issue of creating a national identity that just doesn't exist, and let alone a regional identity. You have diversity to manage. So all these things matter, but I think there's been perhaps too much focus on the politics in the last few years. And if we need to start addressing some of these underlying economic issues, because that's what gives hope, and that's what gives prospect of prosperity, and around that we can start to create national unity and regional unity.
Majid Jafar, CEO of Crescent Petroleum, thank you so much for joining us. Louisa, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Hadley, thank you very much. Good stuff, very interesting. Hadley joining us live there with Majid from Davos. At another camera.